On 20 May 1943, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King signed an order in Washington that the Navy announced as quietly as it could he had just created a fleet with no hulls. 10th Fleet would, in days that followed, command 3,000 Allied ships, hundreds of aircraft, and one stolen machine, a four-rotor Enigma, recovered out of a sinking U-boat the previous autumn. A fleet without hulls had just been put in charge of sinking hulls. The greatest reversal in naval history had begun, and most U-boat crews at sea that week had not yet been told. The blacked-out coast, too, understand how the United States turned the Atlantic into a U-boat graveyard. You first have to look at the way the Atlantic looked in the first half of 1942. Not in the dark of the deep, in the dark of the shore. Operation Paukenschlag, the drumbeat, had begun on 13 January 1942, when the first wave of Type 9 boats slipped out of French ports and ran west across the Atlantic to hunt in the bright sea lanes off the United States. Coastal cities were blacked out under fear of air attack. Convoys had not been organized. Aircraft patrols had not been organized. The radar net that would in time close the gap had not been organized. The radio receivers that would in time locate the boats had not been organized. The merchant ships themselves were lit, in many cases, by their own navigation lights and the orange glow of their own stacks, because the Navy had not yet told them to put the lights out. The boats came in close. They came in very close. From January through July 1942, German U-boats operating in American waters sank roughly 609 Allied merchant ships for a loss of only 22 boats of their own. Some of the boats sank their targets within sight of shore. Crews at Cape May, in New Jersey, could read the silhouettes of surfaced U-boats through their binoculars. Beachgoers at Atlantic City watched the orange glow of burning tankers from the boardwalk. The press reported the attacks in the open. The boats were so confident that some captains rested on the surface in daylight to let their crews take sun, several hundred meters from shore. The graveyard was not, at first, what the boats were looking for. The boats were looking for tonnage, and they were finding it faster than the Navy could count it. But the men lighting fuses in Washington were not asleep, and the engineers in laboratories on both sides of the Atlantic were not idle. The technology while the merchant ships burned, 3 technologies, 1 British American, 1 British, were quietly closing the door on the Wolfpack. The first was the 10-centimeter air-to-surface radar, the ASV Mark III, carried by Coastal Command and later by the U.S. Navy's own air squadrons. Earlier radar sets had run on a 1.5-meter wavelength that left the operator hunting in the middle of a sea of clutter. The new 10-centimeter set cut through the noise. A surfaced U-boat at night from 20 miles away would show as a clear pip on a small green scope, even in heavy weather. The second was high-frequency direction finding, the HFDF the operators nicknamed Huff Duff. The radio operators on the boats were using high-frequency signals to report their position back to U-boat headquarters. HFDF stations on shore, 3 of them, properly spaced, could triangulate the position of any boat transmitting, almost as soon as the transmission ended. The boat's signal betrayed the boat before the boat could swing its torpedoes. The third was the Hedgehog, and a head-throw projector of 24 contact firing charges mounted on the bows of escort vessels. Earlier depth charges had been thrown over the stern, but over the stern, after the attacking escort had already crossed over the contact. The Hedgehog fired charges 25 yards in front of the escort, in a pattern that covered roughly half the diameter of a typical submarine contact. A single contact detonated under the hull would cripple the boat. The first kill with the new weapon came on 2 February 1942 when Ms. Westcott used a Hedgehog salvo to sink U-581 in the Atlantic. The kill was clean, fast, and without survivors. By the end of 1942, every escort in the Atlantic would, in time, be fitted with the same projector. By the end of 1943, the projector would be the standard tool of the trade. You remember the boats off the Jersey shore, sunning themselves in daylight. You will see exactly why, by the end of this story, those boats were not sunning themselves much longer. But a weapon is only as good as the eye that fires it, and an eye in a quiet war at sea has to be told where to look. The fleet without hulls on 20 May 1943. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, signed the order establishing the U.S. 10th Fleet. The fleet had no hulls. It had no battleships, no carriers, no cruisers. It had a handful of desks in Washington and a staff of officers who had been drawn from every corner of the Atlantic War. It would not, technically, ever go to sea. It would never fire a torpedo, never launch an aircraft, never depth charge a contact. It would, in the months that followed, command the American portion of the entire Atlantic Ass campaign, every escort carrier, every destroyer escort, every convoy escort, every long-range patrol aircraft, every radar station, every HFDF station, every merchant routing officer along the eastern seaboard. The point of the fleet was not firepower. The point of the fleet was coordination. Until May 1943, the boats had been hunted by a scattered set of escorts, escorts whose orders came from scattered commands, whose intelligence was scattered among the most scattered of all. 10th Fleet consolidated that scattered command into a single war room. The desk on which the order was signed that morning was, in time, more dangerous to the U-boat arm than any single Allied ship ever built. By mid-1943, the fleet with no hulls had authority over every Allied ASU asset in the Atlantic. By summer 1943, the boats that had once hunted the seas in daylight had lost, for a season at least, the sea they had hunted in. But commanding is not the same as finding. The fleet had not yet closed the air gap. Closing the air gap the middle of the Atlantic had, for nearly 3 years, been a quiet gray space. The boats had hunted there because no Allied aircraft could reach there. The eastern air cover, out of Iceland, ran roughly to 30 degrees west. The western air cover, out of Newfoundland and the Greenland-Iceland gap, ran roughly to 35 degrees west. Between those limits lay a band of ocean several hundred miles wide, the mid-Atlantic air gap, in which a surfaced U-boat had a near-perfect sanctuary. The boats could charge batteries in the gap at midnight, could shadow a convoy in the gap in daylight, and could swing their torpedoes in the gap at dusk. They had done all three for years. The aircraft that could close the gap was the very long-range Liberator, the B-24 in its maritime patrol form. Coastal Command had asked for hundreds of them since 1941. By April 1943, roughly 40 of the new Bill Vleur Liberators had been ferried to RAF St. Maughan and to the operational bases of Coastal Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force. By the end of May 1943, the gap that had been the boat's haven was no longer a haven. By the end of June 1943, the gap was closed. The graveyard gained, in May 1943, the very thing it had been missing: eyes. But eyes are not the same as teeth. The fleet now had eyes. The fleet now needed a hunt. ONS 5 on 29 April 1943, Admiral Dönitz released his boats against convoy, ONS 5. He sent 40 boats. They were to converge on a slow eastbound convoy of 42 merchant ships, hedged by an escort of 7 warships under Commander Peter Gretton. The boats were to attack in wolfpack formation on the surface, by night, in numbers no escort could handle at once. The boats had done this, with success, every spring of the war. Dönitz expected this one to be no different. It was different in every way. Between 29 April and 6 May 1943, the boats converged. Some of them had been read by Bletchley Park on the way in. and the convoy escort had been rerouted to use the Reed. Some of them had been triangulated by Huff Duff stations and tracked by air patrols and their positions pushed into the convoy's track. Some of them had been hit by aircraft lit by lee lights in the gap that, by then, was no longer a gap. In the end, 6 U-boats were sunk outright, and 7 more were damaged so badly they returned to base unable to dive, sometimes unable even to surface. 12 merchant ships went down, 40 boats went out, 6 came home as coffins, 7 came home as cripples. The Wolfpack had thrown its biggest attack of 1943 at a convoy it could not find, then could not surprise, and then could not escape. The boats that had hunted close to the Jersey shore in daylight 1 year earlier were being hunted on a different ocean, in a different month, by a different war. You are now seeing exactly why, by the end of this story, those open Atlantic daylight runs were no longer safe. Because in May 1943, the sea that had once sheltered the boats began, at last, to shelter against them. But the hunter learns. The Wolfpack tried again. 1 week later, SC-130 convoy SC-130 sailed west, slow with 35 merchant ships, on 18 May 1943. The escort was Group B-7, a tired-looking formation of 2 sloops, a frigate, and a corvette under the command of a Royal Navy officer with a stubble of 3 days' watch on his face. The boats that came out to attack were U-209, U-258, U-381, U-531, U-954, and 12 others. They had orders from Dönitz, relayed through Lorient. The orders were for a Wolfpack action. The orders were, in time, what the orders had been in 1942. Shadow by day, mass by night, surface fire, fade before dawn. The orders did not work. The escorts did not panic. The escort commander kept the convoy in tight formation through the night and read every signal that came in. On the night of 18 May, the escort fought off the first wave of attackers. On the night of 19 May, the escort fought off the second. By the night of 22 May, the boats had lost 2 of their number to the escort's hedgehogs and depth charges. On the night of 23 May, they lost a third. On the night of 24 May, they lost 2 more. By the time the convoy reached the western air cover on 25 May, no merchant ship had been lost. 5 boats had been sunk. U-954 was one of them. Peter Dönitz, the admiral's son, went down with her. SC-130 was not a famous convoy. It was not the largest convoy of the war. It was the convoy in which Admiral Dönitz lost his own son, and in which the Wolfpack had, for the first time in a war, lost more men than the merchant ships it had come to attack. By the time the convoy tied up at its destination, no Allied sailor who had fought through the battle could remember when, in the last month, the Wolfpack had succeeded in similar numbers. If you have stayed with us this far, and if you want to see what happens next, hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is the month the graveyard opened. Do not go anywhere. Black May 1943, all of it, every day of it, was the worst month the U-boat arm would ever suffer. The boats had come in by the dozens and had gone down by the dozens. By the close of the month, 41 U-boats had been lost at sea, with 3 more lost in port to accidents and to Allied bombing. Some sources place the figure slightly higher. That small, unnamed difference is itself a kind of detail because it shows how fast the boats were vanishing, in some cases without any confirmed report at all. Some boats were depth-charged by escorts who had read the contact report the boat had just sent. Some boats were bombed by aircraft lit by a lee light halfway down the sky. Some were rammed. Some simply disappeared into the deep and were never heard from again. The losses came in clusters. On the morning of 6 May, 3 boats failed to report from mid-Atlantic. On 12 May, 4 went down in a single night of convoy escort action. By the close of May, The boats that had sailed the Atlantic in March were, by casualty ratio alone, effectively gone. The previous monthly record for U-boat losses was 19, 41 nearly doubled it. Of those 41 boats, more than half were sunk in company with a convoy they had come to attack. Allied tonnage production in April and May 1943 had, for the first time, surpassed Allied losses to the U-boat fleet. The arithmetic of the war had turned. And this was the deeper lesson. The U-boat had not been defeated because the Allies had built a better submarine. They had not. The U-boat had been defeated because the Allies had built a better system. Codebreakers, convoy escorts, aircraft, radar, Huff Duff, Hedgehog, Vlur liberators, hunter-killer groups, escort carriers, every one of them reaching into the dark by a different arm, and the arm that had held the dark for 4 years finally tired. On the night of 24 May 1943, Admiral Dönitz withdrew his operational U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The drumbeat on the Atlantic, the Paukenschlag he had ordered in 1942, the second happy time, the boats sunning themselves on the surface within sight of Atlantic City, fell silent. The weapon that had nearly starved Britain was, by order of its own commander, kept out of the waters where Britain lived. The graveyard had opened, in the same Atlantic, in the same months, by the same boats. The graveyard had been waiting in the same ocean all along. What the graveyard became the graveyard was not built of iron. It was built of paper, radar, and one stolen machine. The shoreline at Cape May, in New Jersey, where sailors had once read the silhouettes of surfaced U-boats in the morning sun, was no longer a place the boats came to rest. The boats came to rest now off Trinidad, off the Azores, in places where the Allied ass net was thinner, and in those places they were hunted by the same desks in Washington that had once commanded nothing. He did not yet know the contact report he had just sent had already been read, in English, on the other side of the ocean. He did not yet know that across the Atlantic, leaf by leaf, a quiet officer in a quiet office was feeding every signal he sent into a machine whose answer was death. He did not yet know that what had looked to him like the open Atlantic was, in fact, the inside of a closing trap, and that every morning for months his boat had been listened to in a country he had never seen. Of Germany's roughly 842 operational and training U-boats, the run of sourcebooks places losses at closer to 779 sunk in the war. The surviving boats were surrendered at sea in May 1945 and were scuttled together in Operation Regenbogen in late 1945. Nearly 1,000 iron coffins, at last count, in the cold dark of the Atlantic. The sea was not what killed them that night. The sea was never what killed them. America, fighting back, was legacy. The fall of the U-boat became the foundation of modern American anti-submarine warfare. Every modern Conmar routing table, the routing tables still used by every American convoy planning office today, descends in a direct line from the lessons of May 1943. Every hunter-killer group formation drilled today in any U.S. Navy ASTU squadron descends from those lessons too. Every escort carrier doctrine, every ASTU officer's qualifying exam, every shipboard doctrine that says, in 2026, what a sonar operator should do first when he hears a contact descends from those lessons too. The lesson did not have to be relearned in 1952 or 1982 or any decade since. In NATO fleets today, every new watch officer learns the Atlantic of May 1943 in his first year at sea. The submarine that does not know the lesson is a submarine that does not long survive. The weapon is gone. The principle remains. The ocean was the same ocean. The men who read it had changed. America did not defeat the U-boat by sinking more boats. America defeated the U-boat by reading its weather. The title Returned You came here to ask how America turned the Atlantic into a U-boat graveyard? The answer, if you sit with it, is this. It was the same Atlantic. It was the same U-boat. It was the same steel. It was the same one toilet for 50 men. It was the same 5,318 parts in a leather case, encoding the same air. It was the same old sea. But on the desk in Washington that morning, in May 1943, an admiral signed an order that by degrees read every signal the boats sent, broke every wolf pack they tried to form, found every convoy they tried to attack, and closed every gap in the air through which they had once slipped. The boats did not get weaker. The boats got red. The graveyard was not built of iron. The graveyard was built of paper, radar, and one stolen machine. If you want the next story before anyone else, hit subscribe so you do not miss it. Turn on the bell notifications because every week we tell you how America actually won its war. Drop a like if this one earned it. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.